Ethan Carter stepped out of his sleek midnight blue sedan, the sun catching the polished curves as he shut the door behind him. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly, exuding quiet confidence, and the rhythmic click of his leather shoes echoed across the pavement as he strode toward the towering glass structure of Skyway Aviation headquarters in Dallas, Texas. To most, the building stood as a beacon of success, a modern fortress symbolizing progress in the airline industry. But to Ethan, it was something else entirely. He had spent over 2 decades navigating the skies, logging thousands of hours as a respected pilot. His record was impeccable: commendations, awards for exceptional service, and an unblemished safety history. Yet, beyond his role in the cockpit, he was also a major shareholder in Skyway Aviation, investing not just financially, but with the belief that the company could lead with integrity. Today, however, he was about to confront a hard truth. The turbulence within this company ran far deeper than anything he'd faced in the air. As Ethan approached the entrance, the glass doors slid open to reveal the pristine, minimalist lobby. Behind the marble reception desk sat a young woman, scrolling through her phone, her manicured nails tapping absent-mindedly against the screen. She barely looked up as he approached. "Deliveries go around back," she said flatly, not bothering to meet his gaze. Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, his expression neutral. Adjusting his grip on his leather briefcase, one that held far more than financial reports, he replied evenly, "I'm not here for a delivery." The receptionist finally glanced up, mild irritation flashing across her face. "Maintenance requests are submitted online. You'll need to." "I'm here for the shareholder meeting," Ethan interrupted, his voice calm yet firm. A flicker of something passed across her features, surprise perhaps, or disbelief. Her fingers hovered over her phone as if struggling to reconcile the sharply dressed man before her with whatever assumption had just been shattered. A few feet away, Colin Draper, a mid-level manager with a neatly pressed suit and an air of rehearsed authority, observed the exchange. His lips curled into a faint smirk, his eyes narrowing slightly as if assessing a potential problem. The receptionist hesitated before picking up the phone, her voice dropping to a whisper. Ethan could almost hear her internal script. Confirm, double-check, don't assume. And yet the expression on her face made it clear, assumptions had already been made. "I'm sorry, sir," she trailed off, waiting for him to offer anything to ease the moment. "Ethan Carter," he stated, letting his name settle into the space between them like a challenge. Silence filled the lobby. A few employees nearby exchanged glances, their murmured whispers curling through the air like smoke. Ethan remained still, his presence an anchor against the weight of doubt. He had seen this pattern before. The quiet hum of bias, the slow erosion of respect. A few moments later, Colin Draper finally stepped forward, his voice dripping with forced warmth. "Mr. Carter," he said smoothly, "we weren't expecting you quite so early." Ethan met his gaze with an unwavering stare. "I make it a habit to show up when it matters." Colin's smile tightened, polite, controlled, but never reaching his eyes. "Well then," he said, gesturing toward the elevators, "let's not keep you waiting." As Ethan walked past the receptionist, a flush of realization crept onto her face. Regret, recognition, maybe even embarrassment. Colin followed closely behind, his own polished shoes making barely a sound on the marble floor. But Ethan's footsteps were steady, deliberate, each one echoing with the weight of what was to come. Because today, the story wouldn't unfold as they expected. Today, Ethan Carter wasn't just another name in the system. Today, he was the storm. And the winds of change were already howling at the door. Around the room, whispers curled like smoke, carrying quiet speculation and unspoken judgment. Ethan Carter remained still, an anchor against the subtle tide of doubt. He had seen this dance before. The slow shuffle of prejudgment, the quiet hum of bias, the sharp sting of being measured as less than. "Mr. Carter, of course." Colin Draper finally stepped forward, his voice carefully balanced between feigned warmth and real discomfort. "We weren't expecting you quite so early." Ethan met his gaze with unwavering calm. He offered a measured nod. "I make it a habit to show up when it matters." Colin's smile tightened, the kind that stretched across his face but never reached his eyes. "Well then," he gestured toward the elevators, his voice smoothly controlled. "Let's not keep you waiting." As Ethan walked past, the receptionist's cheeks flushed, a slow bloom of realization and regret. She had misjudged him. Colin Draper followed close behind, his polished shoes silent against the marble floor. But Ethan's footsteps were different, purposeful, deliberate, carrying the weight of what was about to unfold. Because today, the story wouldn't end the way they expected. Today, Ethan Carter wasn't just another name on a roster. Today, he was the storm. And the winds of change were already howling at the door. The boardroom was a glass-walled battlefield, where power disguised itself in tailored suits and hushed voices. Inside, executives murmured over projected growth charts, fingers tapping against polished wood as numbers and expansion plans filled the air. At the head of the table, Victor Langston, the chief operating officer of Skyway Aviation, stood mid-presentation. His silver hair and crisp demeanor radiated authority. His voice carried smoothly until his gaze landed on Ethan. For just a fraction of a second, Victor faltered. It was barely noticeable. A pause, a hesitation, but in a room built on perception, it was enough. Then, just as quickly, his expression tightened back into its usual corporate mask. "Mr. Carter," he greeted flatly, "we weren't expecting you." Ethan offered a polite nod, entirely unfazed by the cool reception. "I thought it was important to be here," he replied, sliding into a seat near the center of the table. A ripple of movement spread through the room. Subtle, but telling. Executives shifted in their chairs, exchanging careful glances. Ethan placed his leather briefcase on the table. His movements were deliberate. He unfastened the clasps, the soft click echoing louder than it should in the stillness. "I'd like to discuss a matter of significant importance," he said, pulling out a thick, stapled report. The cover bore the emblem of an independent audit firm, its title sharp and undeniable: Discrimination and Bias in Hiring and Promotion Practices at Skyway Aviation. The air in the room thinned. Victor Langston's knuckles whitened around the edges of his presentation remote. Across from him, Daniel Whitmore, the vice president of operations, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. His expression carried a faint smirk, the kind that suggested he was indulging a child's conspiracy theory, rather than facing the weight of hard evidence. Ethan continued, his voice steady. "This report," he said, his tone cool but unwavering, "outlines a pattern of systemic bias within our company. It includes hiring data, promotion records, and testimonials from both current and former employees." He flipped the report open, rotating it toward them. Pages of raw data stared back at the executives. Graphs, statistics, and case studies, all pieces of a narrative that Skyway Aviation had carefully curated and concealed over the past 5 years. "The findings," Ethan stated, "are alarming." And for the first time, no one in the room could dismiss them. Noelle Lawson cleared her throat, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I reported harassment from a senior manager," she said, her words measured but unshaken. "When nothing was done, I pushed harder. HR told me they'd look into it." She exhaled, her hands clasped in front of her. "Instead, I was reassigned to less favorable routes. My hours were cut. When I asked why, I was told I wasn't a good fit for the team." Her words were like a lit match, and the discomfort around the table, dry tinder. Executives shifted in their seats, eyes darting from one another. Daniel Whitmore's confident smirk had vanished. His fingers tapped against the table, restless, uncertain. At the head of the table, Victor Langston's face had tightened, his cool facade cracking just enough to reveal something beneath it: panic. Meanwhile, across from them, Samantha Green sat pale and rigid. She knew what was inside that folder: emails, notes from ignored meetings, documents with her own initials at the bottom. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them on the table, the weight of complicity pressing down. "You knew about this?" Daniel hissed under his breath, his words slipping out before he could stop them. Samantha didn't answer. She couldn't. The truth was tightening around her like a noose, and with every word Noelle spoke, it drew just a little tighter. Other executives fidgeted. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, and they could feel it. Ethan Carter leaned back in his chair, letting the silence speak for him. He had walked into the boardroom as a question mark. Now, he was the period at the end of a very decisive sentence. And as Noelle finished her story, the reality set in. This wasn't a meeting, it was a reckoning. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Ethan let it sit there, a drawn bowstring, a tension that refused to ease. Then, with the same deliberate calm, he reached into his briefcase. This time, he pulled out a sleek black voice recorder and placed it on the table. The metallic click of the power button sliced through the quiet like a blade. Then came the voice. Grainy, but unmistakable. Victor Langston, speaking in a low tone, the kind people use when they think no one is listening. Just keep them in maintenance roles. We don't need diversity slowing us down. The words hung in the air like toxic fumes. Settling, suffocating. Victor's face flickered through a spectrum of emotions. Shock, anger, denial, all within seconds. His lips parted, a weak chuckle escaped, an unsteady attempt to downplay the gravity of what had just been exposed. "This is taken out of context," he stammered, his voice raw with desperation. "That conversation was about operational efficiency. You can't possibly—" "No," Ethan interrupted, his voice steady and unyielding. "The context is crystal clear." He leaned forward, locking eyes with Victor. "This was recorded during a discussion about internal promotions," he said. Specifically, why qualified black candidates weren't being considered. A fresh wave of silence crashed over the room. The kind of silence that suffocates. The kind where even breathing feels intrusive. Executives sat frozen, their eyes locked on the recorder, as if willing it to rewind itself, to undo what had just been laid bare. But the truth sat between them, immovable and undeniable. Noelle took a step forward, her presence a reminder that this wasn't just about policies. It was about people. "I believed the company would protect me," she said softly, but her voice carried the weight of countless silenced voices. "I believed I would be heard." She swallowed, steadying herself. "Instead, I was met with silence. Emails went unanswered. Meetings were canceled. I was reassigned to shifts that barely covered my rent." A single tear glimmered in her eye, but she refused to let it fall. "I wasn't just losing hours," she said. "I was losing hope." Her gaze swept the room, landing on every executive who had once dismissed her. "The message was clear," she continued, her voice unwavering. "My voice didn't matter." And for the first time, the people in power were forced to listen. Executives avoided Noelle Lawson's gaze. Others, perhaps for the first time, truly looked at her and saw more than just a name on a complaint form. The walls of the boardroom seemed to contract around her story, as if trying to contain the raw, undeniable truth. At the far end of the table, Samantha Green sat frozen, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her mind raced. The past emails, the ignored meetings, the moments where she could have acted but instead had chosen the easier path of compliance. She had built walls around herself, compartmentalizing every decision under the comfortable guise of just doing her job. But now, those walls were crumbling. Her loyalty, to the company, to her career, had always been her anchor. But as she looked at Noelle, at the quiet pain and unwavering strength in her eyes, something inside shifted. A tide of guilt, long buried, began to rise, eroding the carefully constructed reality she had used to justify her silence. She was at a crossroads, one where every decision from this moment forward would echo for years to come. And doing nothing was no longer an option. As Noelle sat down, the room remained silent. A silence full of questions, the kind of silence that demands answers. Ethan Carter's gaze swept across the table, steady and unrelenting. It was clear, the time for silence was over. He let the tension linger a moment longer. Then, moving with quiet precision, he reached into his briefcase one last time. This time, he pulled out a small, discreetly labeled USB drive. His movements were measured, deliberate. He slid the drive into the conference room's media hub. A few taps on the remote, the screen at the end of the table flickered to life. Then, the room filled with sound, a crackling recorded phone call. A voice, unmistakable. Victor Langston. But this time, the smooth corporate veneer was gone. His tone was raw, unfiltered. "Just keep them in maintenance roles. We don't need diversity slowing us down." Then another voice, Colin Draper. Dismissive. Casual. "We'll just tell them there are no openings. They'll get the hint eventually." The recording ended abruptly. The room was left in stunned silence. A silence so deep the only thing filling the air was the hum of the projector. Faces that had once worn masks of professional detachment now twisted into something else. Shock, fear, guilt, arrogance drained from expressions that had once been smug and composed. Daniel Whitmore, who had sat just moments ago with crossed arms and a smirk, now looked like the air had been punched out of him. His lips moved, forming words that never came. At the head of the table, Victor's hand twitched at his side, a nervous tick betraying his rapidly crumbling composure. His face turned an uneven shade of red, the flush creeping from his collar up to his cheeks. This is completely out of context, he stammered. His voice cracked. There are layers to these decisions. Operational priorities, budget constraints. You can't just isolate one, no. Ethan's voice cut through the air, sharp and cool. This isn't an isolated incident, it's part of a pattern. His eyes locked on Victor's, unwavering. And the evidence shows, Ethan continued, his tone controlled but unyielding, that this isn't the only instance. A visible shudder passed through the room. Victor's defense, thin and fragile, broke beneath the weight of the truth. Executives who had once sat close to him now inched away. Their body language was telling. Their silence? Even more so. Daniel Whitmore saw the writing on the wall. His eyes darted between Victor and Ethan, searching for an escape, some way to salvage the wreckage. Listen, Daniel began, his voice suddenly smooth, his tone shifting to something oily with false sincerity. I had no knowledge of this. I've always advocated for fair practices. Really? Ethan interrupted. He tapped the remote again. A new audio clip began to play. Daniel's own voice echoed back to him. If they don't like it, they can leave. Plenty of people would kill for their jobs. The blood drained from Daniel's face. The room felt colder. The space between the executives widened, like a rift splitting the table in two. Victor and Daniel, once the untouchable forces of this boardroom, now sat exposed. Stripped of the power they had wielded for so long. The boardroom that had once been their domain now felt like a courtroom. And Ethan Carter? He wasn't just another shareholder anymore. He was the prosecutor, and justice was coming. Their defenses were shredded. The boardroom, once a space of controlled power, now felt more like a courtroom. And Ethan Carter? He was the prosecutor, calm and relentless, delivering the final blow. But the reckoning didn't stop there. The fallout began before the meeting had even ended. By the time Ethan stepped out of the boardroom, his phone was already buzzing with notifications. The first news alert flashed across his screen. Skyway Aviation accused of systemic discrimination. Whistleblower reveals damning evidence. Within hours, the story exploded. Major outlets like CNN, Forbes, and Bloomberg ran headlines that pulled no punches. Airline executives caught in scandal. Discrimination and deception unveiled. Leaked audio exposes racism at Skyway Aviation. Social media erupted. Former and current employees came forward, sharing their own experiences of bias, of promotions denied, of voices ignored. Flight attendants, maintenance workers, even pilots. Each post was another crack in the company's already crumbling foundation. And a hashtag started to spread, one that couldn't be ignored, grounded by racism. Every tweet, every personal story was another layer in the avalanche burying Skyway Aviation under the weight of its own misdeeds. As the story spread, so did the legal ramifications. By the next morning, 3 former employees had officially filed lawsuits against Skyway Aviation. One was a maintenance worker, denied promotions for years despite seniority. Another was a pilot, whose repeated applications for captain training had been ignored. The third, of course, was Noelle Lawson, her wrongful dismissal case now carrying undeniable weight. But the lawsuits were just the beginning. Legal analysts speculated on something much bigger, a class action lawsuit. And within days, it became reality. A top-tier law firm announced their intent to represent dozens of current and former employees who had experienced discriminatory practices. They called it the largest workplace discrimination case in aviation history. The financial impact was immediate. Investors panicked. Fearing the fallout, they pulled out in droves. Skyway Aviation's stock plummeted, losing 20% of its value in a single day. The board of directors scrambled, watching helplessly as their company, once a blue-chip investment, now looked more like a sinking ship. And everyone inside was reaching for a life raft. Inside the company, chaos reigned. The halls, once filled with confident executives walking with purpose, were now filled with something else. People carrying cardboard boxes. One by one, the departures began. Victor Langston was the first to go. A carefully worded statement from the PR team framed his exit as stepping down to focus on family. But everyone knew the truth. He had been forced out. Daniel Whitmore followed close behind. His departure was quieter, marked only by hurried goodbyes and whispered speculation. And then Samantha Green. Her face was pale as she stood before the press, but her back was straight. She announced her full cooperation with the internal investigation. Her guilt had transformed into something else, resolve. And her decision to testify against her former colleagues added yet another twist to the growing scandal. Desperate to salvage what remained of their reputation, Skyway Aviation's board of directors implemented emergency measures. They brought in external auditors. They hired diversity consultants. They announced a full overhaul of HR practices. Their official statements promised transparency and change. But to the public, it all felt too little too late. Trust had been shattered. Every new promise from Skyway Aviation felt too little too late. Employees staged walkouts, a silent but powerful protest. Test flights were delayed. Customer service lines jammed. Passengers demanded answers. And when none came, they made a different choice. They flew with other airlines. Competitors seized the opportunity, launching promotions and openly advertising their commitment to diversity. Skyway Aviation, once a symbol of progress, had become a cautionary tale. Through it all, Ethan Carter watched, his expression calm, his resolve steady. He hadn't come to destroy the company, he had come to expose the truth. And as that truth burned through Skyway's carefully crafted image, the smoke signaled more than just the end of an era. It marked the beginning of something new. Across the city, Victor Langston's phone buzzed sharply against his mahogany conference table. A low, ominous vibration. He glanced at the screen. His face paled. He recognized the number. Thomas Keane, a major investor, a man whose influence stretched far beyond Skyway Aviation. Victor answered, carefully measuring his tone, but within seconds, the color drained completely from his face. "What do you mean?" they pulled out. His voice was a rasp, laced with panic. Across the room, Ethan Carter sat motionless, his expression unreadable. But in his eyes, a flicker of quiet satisfaction. He had anticipated this moment. Even before stepping into the boardroom, he had already spoken with key investors. He had shared the evidence, laid out the consequences, made sure they understood the risk of staying tied to a sinking ship, and now they were cutting their losses. As Victor ended the call, chaos erupted in the boardroom. Executives, once allies, turned on each other with the desperation of rats fleeing a burning vessel. Accusations flew. Daniel Whitmore's voice rose above the rest, his usual bravado replaced with a shrill defensiveness. "I had no idea this was all Victor's doing." At the other end of the table, Samantha Green, who had remained silent for most of the meeting, finally spoke. Her words weren't loud, but they cut through the noise like a blade. "We all knew. We just chose not to see it." A hush fell over the room, a quiet condemnation, one that left nowhere to hide. Victor pushed back from the table, his chair screeching against the floor. His voice wavered, no longer commanding, no longer the voice of power. "If you think I'm taking the fall for this alone," he spat, "you're mistaken." But the bravado was gone. What remained was a hollow shell of the powerful man he once was. And when he finally muttered his resignation, it came out not as a decision, but as a surrender. The final unraveling. The last thread snapping under the weight of the truth. The press conference room was packed. Bright lights bore down on Samantha Green as she stepped behind the podium. Camera flashes came in waves, each one a reminder that there was no turning back. Her fingers gripped the edges of the lectern, her knuckles white. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I failed to act when it mattered most." The room stilled. I was aware of complaints regarding discrimination and harassment at Skyway Aviation. I documented them. I filed them. And then, I buried them. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Pens scribbled. Cameras rolled. Her admission wasn't just a crack in the wall. It was a full-scale demolition. She recounted instances where she had been pressured by senior management to close cases without investigation, to quietly push out employees who spoke up. Each story was another weight pressing down on Skyway Aviation, dragging the company further into the depths. The reporters pounced. Their questions came sharp, relentless. "Were you directed to cover up complaints by Victor Langston? How many cases were suppressed? Why speak up now?" Samantha met their questions head on. "I stayed silent to protect my career. I was wrong. I am now fully cooperating with the investigation to ensure this never happens again." Her voice, though burdened by guilt, carried something else. Resolve. Because while Skyway Aviation was falling apart, something new was being built in its place. Guilt had turned into something else. Resolve. It was a small redemption, but a powerful one. Beyond the immediate fallout, the scandal at Skyway Aviation sent shockwaves through the entire aviation industry. Competitor airlines didn't just capitalize on the company's downfall. They saw an opportunity to reshape their image. They launched new initiatives emphasizing diversity, equity, and inclusion. Job postings highlighted fair hiring practices. Executives released statements affirming their commitment to diverse leadership, and the market rewarded their transparency. Their stock prices rose as Skyway Aviations continued to plummet. But the ripple effect wasn't just corporate, it was personal. Noelle Lawson's story became a beacon of resilience. She received multiple offers from other airlines, but ultimately, she chose a company that didn't just promise fairness, it demonstrated it. She accepted a leadership role in their diversity and inclusion team, ensuring that voices like hers would never be silenced again. Her story spread, featured in industry magazines and news outlets. She became a sought-after speaker, sharing her experiences at conferences and workshops. Her voice, once drowned in silence, was now heard by thousands. And when she spoke, it wasn't just her story. It was a message of hope, a call to action, a reminder to every worker who had ever felt unseen. Through all the chaos, Ethan Carter watched with quiet fulfillment. He had set out to expose a broken system. And now, real change was taking root. Skyway Aviation might never recover. But from its ashes, something stronger, fairer, and more just was beginning to grow. Across town, in a quiet corner of a coffee shop, two former adversaries sat across from each other. Samantha Green's face, once a mask of corporate composure, now showed every line of regret and exhaustion. But there was something new in her expression. Determination. "I want to testify," she said, her voice firm. "I kept records, emails, memos, everything they told me to bury. I know it won't erase what I've done." She swallowed. "But maybe it can help." Ethan studied her, his expression thoughtful. He had seen this before, the moment when guilt turned into action. When silence gave way to truth. "It can help," he said, "but only if you're willing to go all the way. Your testimony could make the difference in these lawsuits. It could give real weight to the voices that were ignored." Samantha nodded. "I am. I need to make this right." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his tone shifting, less business, more personal. "You know the system from the inside," he said. "Once this is over, you could help rebuild it. Make sure this doesn't happen again. Use your experience to guide real change." A small spark of hope flickered in Samantha's eyes. "You think anyone would give me that chance?" she asked. Ethan held her gaze. "Redemption isn't about what you've done," he said. "It's about what you do next. And you still have time to do the right thing." For the first time in a long time, Samantha saw a path forward. It was narrow, steep, but it was a way forward, and sometimes that was all anyone needed. Outside Skyway Aviation's headquarters, the crowd stretched for blocks, a sea of solidarity. Employees, past and present, stood together, holding signs that read "Justice for all. Equality takes flight." The crowd was diverse: pilots, flight attendants, maintenance workers, all united by a common purpose. The energy in the air was electric, a mix of hope and resolution. As if every story shared, every voice raised, was adding bricks to a new, stronger foundation. And at the center of it all, Ethan Carter and Noelle Lawson. Their presence was a powerful reminder that truth, when spoken boldly, could shake even the mightiest institutions. Media cameras captured every moment. Social media buzzed with live updates, and soon it was clear, Ethan and Noelle were no longer just individuals. They had become symbols of change. Their faces and stories weren't just headlines. They were a movement, one far bigger than themselves. And as they stood before the crowd, speaking not just of Skyway Aviation's failures, but of the systemic issues across industries, they weren't just exposing injustice. They were challenging corporations everywhere to choose integrity over image, truth over silence, and most of all, change over complacency. The reckoning at Skyway Aviation was never just about one company. It was about systemic issues across industries. It was about urging corporations everywhere to choose integrity over image. Inside Skyway, a new era was beginning. The board of directors, after removing the old guard, brought in a new CEO, Isabella Chen, a veteran of the aviation industry, known for transformative leadership. Her first move wasn't about damage control, it was about real change. She implemented comprehensive diversity and inclusion programs, not as a PR stunt, but as a genuine cultural shift. She partnered with advocacy groups, launched transparent reporting systems, established mentorship programs to uplift underrepresented voices. And almost immediately, the changes were visible. Skyway Aviation began hosting open forums where employees could speak without fear. Training programs were redesigned to eliminate bias. Promotions were based on merit and performance, not politics. Slowly, cautiously, trust began to rebuild. In front of a packed auditorium, Ethan Carter took the stage. The room was silent as he delivered his final address. His words were clear, each one a carefully chosen promise. Power is not just about holding a position, he said. It's about what you do with it. It's about creating spaces where everyone has a voice, where fairness isn't just a slogan, but a practice. He let the words settle. Then he asked the question that had driven him from the beginning. We all have influence, whether big or small, and the choice is ours. Do we use it to lift others or to hold them down? The room was silent, not from discomfort, but from reflection. The faces before him didn't just show admiration, they showed responsibility. Because this wasn't just about applause, it was about commitment, a readiness to turn words into action, to ensure that the lessons learned here would never be forgotten. And as Ethan stepped away from the podium, his message rippled outward, a reminder that change did not end with him. It began with everyone who listened. Under Isabella Chen's leadership, Skyway Aviation slowly found its footing again, but this time it wasn't about salvaging a reputation. It was about transforming a culture. Diversity and inclusion became not just buzzwords, but core values. And it didn't stop there. Other airlines took notice. Corporations re-examined their own practices. Ethan Carter's actions had created a ripple effect, an undeniable shift that challenged industries to prioritize fairness and integrity over comfort and tradition. And when Skyway Aviation's planes took to the skies once more, they carried with them a new promise. A promise of equality. A promise of a company willing to learn from its mistakes. A company that would soar higher through accountability. But one question remained. If you had the power to change a system, would you risk everything to do it? It was a question not just for corporate leaders, but for everyone. It challenged each person to consider their own influence. Their own voice. Would they remain silent in the face of injustice? Or would they step forward, even if it meant standing alone? Because this story was never just about Ethan Carter, or Noelle Lawson, or Samantha Green. It was about all of us, about the potential in every person to be a catalyst for change. Because real change, it doesn't come from silence. It comes from speaking up, from challenging what is wrong, and from advocating for what is right. The question isn't whether change is possible. The question is, are you willing to fight for it? Real change doesn't come from silence. It comes from speaking up, from challenging what is wrong, from advocating for what is right. If this story moved you, if it made you think, then don't let it end here. Take the next step. Subscribe for more stories that push boundaries, that expose truths, that inspire action, because every voice counts. And yours? It could be the one that makes all the difference.